present today something on brassica nutrition. And what I plan to cover are these things. It's important to understand brassica nutrition, to understand some of the thing about growth stages and life cycle. And the nutrients that I want to cover are nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, and boron. And so that's what we'll cover are these things in the first 15 minutes or so. This is weird because I can't see what's on the screen. I just see my first slide here, so I've got to look over my shoulder to see what is on the screen. Just to cover crop stages really quickly here. Planting, winter rosette, spring rosette, bolting, initial bloom, early bloom, full bloom, pod fill, and harvest. Those are the crop stages that I'll use in this presentation. And this is a relationship between days after planting and growing degree days. Crop stages are driven by growing degree days, but we usually measure things by calendar day. Just wanted to point out that they are driven by growing degree days. So just to review some of these crop stages, here's planting. If any of you planted canola, it's a challenge to find the seed sometimes. So planting, emergence, seedling. This is my daughter. She's not quite that age anymore. But seedling stage, rosette. Get an idea what a rosette is, and I'm not going to go through all these stages, but you get the picture here, right? This is a crop development sequence. So if we come to nutrients, this is some work we did in the past, and what this chart is this is dry matter times 100. Thank you. This is dry matter times 100 there on your left. So what this is a crop of canola, and we had 9,200 pounds. That yellow bar is 9,200 pounds of residue, and we harvested 3,400 pounds of canola seed. And then if you look at the distribution of N, S, and P there, you see the nitrogen in the straw or the nitrogen in the grain. See the sulfur in the straw or the grain, and you see the phosphorus in the straw or the grain. That's just kind of the partitioning at harvest of what it looks like. And if you compare this kind of to wheat, the big difference is if you look at the dry matter nitrogen content, canola straw has about twice the amount of nitrogen that wheat straw does. And that really changes the nutrient cycling and how quickly this crop turns over and provides nutrients to the next crop. So that's one of the big differences between having brassicas in your rotation versus having cereals, is that nutrient turnover. This is the dry matter accumulation curve for winter canola. There are the crop stages as you go across the bottom, and you'll note this comes up to almost 16,000 pounds of dry matter. So canola is a high residue crop, but it's also a fragile residue crop because of the nitrogen in the tissue, and it disappears fairly quickly. Now the next curve I'm going to show you is the dry matter plus the nitrogen accumulation curve. And if you take anything with you today, this next slide is the one you need to take home. Okay, so if you have only a little space in your brain, fill it up with this next slide and then you can go, okay? This is the nitrogen accumulation curve and the dry matter accumulation curve. And if you look at this, it's about early bloom. You have, this crop's taking all the nitrogen it's going to take up. And the important thing here is, at bolting, all of the nutrition that crop is going to have or needs to be there just prior to bolting, especially in our dryland situation. If you don't get it on then, you're not going to get it in the plant. And the difference between this and wheat is this takes place fairly early in our area. It's about middle of March. You know, depending on the environment, you may be earlier or later than that, but you know, everything has to be there by the middle of March to make this crop. And if you look at this is some work we did in a couple years in a row. This is about a 3,000 pound canola crop. And you know, we're taking up about 230 pounds of nitrogen at the peak there at early bloom. Why does that go down after that? It's just an artifact of measurement, right? We're starting to lose blossoms, we start to senesce leaves. So dry matter's not really going down, that's just our ability to collect it, right? Those damn graduate students, you can't get them to pick up flower petals and leaves, right? Because they blow away. So, you know, this goes down, you know, really it's a plateau. It stays there, but, you know, we're starting to senesce and we just, you know, we're not very good at accounting. This Enron accounting system, right? Just for comparison purposes, I think yesterday, at least in some of the sessions, you heard about elk liking canola and munching it off. Well, this is the nitrogen accumulation curve, but also on here is the concentration curve in the tissue. So you have your nitrogen accumulation curve, and then you have the percent in the tissue. So at winter rosette, nearly 5% nitrogen in that plant tissue. So this is a real good food source for elk and deer or any other critter that likes to munch on green tissue, but it has a high nitrate content. And this is really characteristic for any plant growth. This just happens to be one for canola. Wheat, any other crop has, you know, the shape is the same, it's just the timing and the stages that are a little bit different. Yeah, now I'll just review what knowing what the accumulation curves are and stuff. I'll review kind of what our management recommendations for canola and brassicas are. The nitrogen requirement that we have, and this is based on several years of nitrogen rate studies in canola, and this is what we have for spring canola, mustard, and winter canola. 7 pounds of nitrogen per 100 pounds of grain yield is our recommendation. And so to get a recommendation, it's the expected yield times the nitrogen requirement minus your soil test information. Then, so as an example, you know, in our environment, we might expect a 3,000 pound crop. We might have a soil test profile that looks like this, carrying about 60 pounds, 65 pounds of nitrogen. And we do that calculation, and the nitrogen recommendation for this crop would be 145 pounds. We've changed some things in the last couple years by planting canola in June, winter canola in June. So for the last 2 years, what we've been working on is we planted in June, you know, when do we apply that nitrogen? Do we plant it at planting? Do we plant it in the fall? Do we apply it in the spring? And so to kind of answer that question, this is kind of new to us. So to answer that question, what we did in the last 2 years, we've come up with some nitrogen treatments, and so we're splitting them between planting, applying it in the fall, or applying it in the spring. So this is canola planted in June. Do we put it on when we plant? Do we put it on in the fall? Or do we put it on in the spring? That's a question we need to answer, because we've changed, you know, the time of planting, and we're growing in this warm season of the year, and that plant dies back and loses some tissue. So, you know, what's the best nitrogen management strategy for that kind of growing scenario? So what we've done the last 2 years are these treatments. And if you remember the environment the last 2 years, I'm going to show you a data slide here next. But remember what 2013 was like for us. It was a drought year. And so this is what we saw in 2013 and 2014 harvest year. Those blue bars, all our treatments were the same. Didn't make any difference because we had a drought year and we had poor yields of some of the poorest winter canola. My winter canola got all of that high in 2012. I've never seen winter canola that small. I mean, I had wheat taller than the winter canola. Drought year, drought in March. But last year we did end up with some results. And if you go back here and look toward the bottom of this chart, we see a bunch of splits. Some at planting, some in the fall, some in the spring. And we come to this year, and I want to caution you, this is 1 year's worth of data. So you don't want to bet the farm on 1 year's worth of data, okay? I just want to show you that we're doing this work and we're thinking about what's going on because of early planting. But what we're seeing, or at least what we saw this year, is these splits. Some at planting, some in the fall, some in the spring. What you don't want to do is put it all on at planting. That's not good. You don't want to wait and put it all on in the fall or in the spring. So it looks like from 1 year's data, what we would recommend is some kind of split. My gut feeling is when we soil tested this stuff, we're carrying about 65, 70 pounds of N in the profile at planting time. If you have that kind of level, I don't think you have to apply any at planting. Do it, split it in the fall and split it in the spring. So that's nitrogen. Let's talk about phosphorus. You have a question, Aaron?
When you apply at planting, are you putting that on, how close to the seed?
The question is, where are we placing this when we apply it? At planting time, we essentially we're doing we drill it in the plot with our seed drill. So we're using the seed drill as an applicator, and then we come back and seed into it. So it's two operations because, OSU doesn't have expensive direct seed equipment that. No, we try to go about 3 to 4 inches deep. Take the packer wheels pressure off and go in as deep as our drill will go, about 3 or 4 inches, and then we seed at the appropriate depth with the canola, which is usually about 3/4 of an inch into moisture. So the placement would be about 2 inches below the seed and kind of random arrangement along the row because I don't have a tractor driver that can hit that exact row where the fertilizer was. And if you have somebody like that, let me know. Good question. Yeah, I'm going to leave nitrogen and we'll get to phosphorus and sulfur here. This is the accumulation curve for phosphorus and sulfur. And if you notice, it's a little bit different. You see the uptake is a little bit later. And you think about these nutrients, particularly phosphorus, the uptake's a little bit later. What's that soil profile doing? It's drying out, right? So phosphorus placement near the seed's important, but phosphorus placement, a little bit deeper is also important because the uptake here is later also. So if you look at this, about 50 pounds of either phosphorus or sulfur in the crop at whatever that optimum is, pod filling right there. So uptake's about 50 pounds of sulfur, 50 pounds of phosphorus. Oops, thought I had one more slide. Oh, okay. Phosphorus, this is our recommendation on phosphorus from our fertilizer guide, depending on how you test, whether you're low, very low, medium, or high. So the recommendation may go from none to about 30 pounds, depending where you soil test. Sulfur looks like this. Again, depending on where you test, low, moderate, or high. Recommendations go from about 10 pounds to 40 pounds. From our work on canola, I like to see 1 pound of sulfur for every 7 pounds of nitrogen. And I've heard ratios, narrower than that, 5 to 1, 4 to 1, 3 to 1. So, take your pick, but, this seems to have worked for us, and this is what's written in the fertilizer guide. With canola, because the sulfur test for us is kind of iffy, I would always do this. For 7 pounds of nitrogen, I would put on a pound of sulfur, regardless of what the soil test said. Because sulfur is important to canola, and you don't want to be short of sulfur. So that, to me, that's a modest input. This is some work we did for several years at Morrow on yellow mustard, which happened to be in spring brassica. And there's a number of treatments that go across here, phosphorus, sulfur, and chloride. And there was interest in chloride for several years. So we did a bunch of treatments here. But if you look at every high bar here, what's the common denominator? It's sulfur. Every treatment that had sulfur responded here. Now, these aren't really great yields, except if you know Morrow, that's pretty good yield, right? And this is just 10 pounds of sulfur. So we're getting about 250-pound yield boost with 10 pounds of sulfur at Morrow. Now, in Oregon, if you know Oregon, there's a coal-fired power plant at Boardman, burns coal. So if you're east of that, you're getting some free sulfur. Morrow happens to be way west of the coal-fired plant, so you're not getting free sulfur. So I think that's part of the reason we see a response when we go west. We do have a recommendation for boron, and it's a few soil tests, depending where you are. If you test greater than 0.5 part per million, there's no recommendation, but if you start testing lower that, it's to add some. Let's say a little bit about here on the summary. This is our summary for brassica. 7 pounds of N is the N requirement. I like to see a pound of phosphorus for every 100 pounds of grain yield, pound of sulfur for every every 100 pounds of grain yield, and boron, zinc, molybdenum, other micronutrients. We just don't have enough information about that to make good recommendations. A lot of more work has been done. I think one of the strategies now is to put out insurance levels of these micros, because we don't know exactly what the response is, and you don't want to be short on these micros because they're important in brassica. So putting out small insurance packages, I think that's where the industry is right now. And given the information we have, that's probably a good strategy. Question is, have we done timing studies on spring canola? And the answer is no, we haven't done that. Basically because we're fairly dry and spring canola is not a very viable crop in our area. And so when we plant spring canola, we just put it all down at planting time. And I've grown some really good spring canola, ton spring canola, but in 20 years I've probably grown ton spring canola twice, and I've grown 200-pound spring canola 18 times. So no, we don't have that. But that's if you're in an environment where spring canola is important, that would definitely be a good question to answer. I've already introduced Marcus, but this is Marcus Bratton, and I'll just turn it over to him.
Okay. Appreciate it. All right. I've had the privilege to work with Don and chat at a number of meetings here. Oops, sorry. Yeah, microphones. Sorry about that. A number of meetings over the last little while, so it's good to be here. I'm from Kalispell, Montana, northwestern Montana. I'm a bit of an ag nerd. I kind of love this stuff, so it's good to be here in one respect, but I look at the breakout sessions that are happening at the same time that I'm speaking, I'm like, wow, I'd like to be in on that one, so appreciate you guys being here. Contact information there, I usually always put that on the first slide because very rarely do I get to the end of any presentation, so feel free to give me a shout, or if you want to holler BS on anything, I'm game with that too. Northwestern Montana, we are predominantly spring canola. We've been trying to make the winter canola thing work from the perspective of greater yield potential as a product of that particular cropping system, but to date, we're pretty much spring canola. We are in a kind of an intermountain valley, so 18 inches of annual precipitation typically. I have a lot of irrigated acres. Cropping system is predominantly spring wheat, canola, pulses, some seed potatoes, that kind of thing. So I tend to look at this crop through that lens, and I realize that that's maybe not the lens that everybody's working within. So bear with me if I answer something and you're like, well, that doesn't work for me. Let's talk about it because I think there's a lot of crossover, and I always learn a lot just by visiting. So anyway, so that's where we're at. I'm going to kind of give more of a kind of my observations of growing this crop. I still touch about 10,000 acres myself directly as an agricultural consultant. My role within AgriTrend is shifting a little bit to training and developing our people, but I love getting in the field. I love soil testing. I love doing tissue tests. I love working with farmers. So a lot of this is going to flow out of my own observations and what we're tweaking and what we're trying to do. Right now, the biggest concern that I have within my area is actually one of pH. And if you're familiar with Montana, typically Montana is characterized as being a very alkaline type soil, 8.2 over 8 pH. In my area, my pH ranges from about 4.3 to 9.3. And I might have that degree of variability on one farm. So the impact of pH has been very pronounced. We're just kind of starting to recognize that and to take steps to try to address it. What I've got on the screen here in front of you is some field level composite pH readings. And you'll see they range from about a 4.5-ish to about 5, I guess. What we did this last year, though, was shift this grower towards precision management. And I just want to point this out real quick because it's quite dramatic. When I take multiple years of aerial, or this is actually satellite imagery, and build zones off of that, and then soil test by zone, the degree of subfield variability ranges from about 4.2 to 6.8. So the ramifications on everything become very, very dramatic. We can talk about, whoops, I'm jumping here. We can talk about how those pHs impact nutrient availability. Don already mentioned the impact on N, P, and K. When we're in that pH range of about 5, fertilizer use efficiency is compromised to the tune of about 50%, just right out of the gate. Okay. We can look at it from the perspective of how it impacts toxicity concerns. So as that pH is falling, we can start to see issues with manganese toxicity and aluminum toxicity, and even potentially some issues with calcium. So this over here is some pictures from, actually this is from the Canadian Canola Council. These aren't ones that I took myself, but calcium deficiency, aluminum toxicity, manganese toxicity. And the point I want to make here is this isn't a universal concern across the entire field, but I've got places within the field that I'm seeing this, and my yield is compromised right out of the gate. Yield and fertilizer efficiency together. And I really think it's in our best interest, and I know Paul's going to talk about pH here, but I want to talk about it from the perspective of what I'm seeing. I think it's in our best interest to take a proactive approach to managing pH, and not to assume that, hey, I just need to go out there and blast it on. Understand that your lime need is going to be variable, and we need to just start chipping away at it. And so that's kind of the approach that I've been taking. One of the other observations that we've made over the years is the importance, at least in my geography, of pop-up fertility. So this is a strip trial that occurred by accident. So the chain fell off the drive on the fertilizer box. So the part of the field here that's definitely lagging behind didn't get the seed place fertility. And this was actually a very, in a lot of respects, this is a field where we probably wouldn't have anticipated a response to phosphate. I mean, we're dealing with 19 parts per million. This is on a bicarbonate extractable phosphorus. Potassium levels are actually very low there. But it's not a field that I would have automatically went to and says, man, we need to make sure we get our phosphorus here because there's going to be a high likelihood of response. Phosphorus levels aren't really too bad. So we had about 20 pounds-ish of P2O5 seed placed and about 10-ish pounds of K2O in the row. And in my area, it's all about trying to get that plant up and going just as fast as we can to get it through blooming before it gets hot. And so I'm trying to do that. That's really been our focus. Playing a lot with nitrogen, and I don't have the answer on nitrogen, but in my world, it's all about trying to maximize nitrogen use efficiency, and that comes from an understanding of what are my loss risk potential, how do I try to synchronize nitrogen uptake with the crop stage. If you look at the nitrogen demand curves, and I've added some here that look at nitrogen demand by crop, so you can kind of compare canola to your spring wheat and that, and what we're observing is that if we get too much nitrogen up front, even on our spring canolas, I get this proliferation of biomass, and that doesn't always go to yield. So I've got this canola crop that turns into a forage crop. It's just huge. We can't really get through it. So we're playing with strategies as how do we change that up? How do we nick up nitrogen need and nitrogen application? And that might be with an in-season UAN app that we're dribbling on, maybe a dry broadcast. Maybe we've even played a little bit with ESN in some of our environments where I've got moisture, spring moisture, early season moisture, where I can move that into the soil profile. It's really about making sure that nitrogen is available when we need it. And it's very, very geography and environment specific. So we could probably spend all day just on that particular piece. Phosphorus and potassium, phosphorus mentioned already, but from my perspective, it's all about understanding the need of the cropping system for these two nutrients. I have to be careful about how much phosphorus I'm placing with the seed. So a lot of times I can't actually cover off and I apologize, I should have converted this to pounds per acres, but in my geography we talk bushels per acre. But at this yield environment, my removal of P2O5 is about 42 pounds per acre. Typically, depending on the equipment, I can't put that much down because of seed safety and that kind of things. And the point here is that somehow we have to make sure that we are applying what we're removing. You look at, and I like this slide because it looks at soil test levels for phosphorus and potassium across North America. And you can see, generally speaking, we're doing a pretty good job with phosphorus. Levels are being maintained. Pacific Northwest, you're doing even better. They're actually being built. The nutrient that I actually get most concerned about, and typically we don't get too worked up over it in canola, but it actually is potassium. And I'm seeing potassium levels fall. The last soil test there, you saw 100 parts per million over 40 parts per million. I realize that's probably unique. We are an irrigated area, high rainfall area, those kind of things, but one of the things that we want to think about. I think it's critical to place it in the context of what our yield environment is going to be 15 years from now. Okay? World record corn, I realize we're not talking about corn. World record corn yield grown here just this last year. Anybody know what the bushels were? 503 bushels. You know what the potassium uptake of that crop was? 650 pounds of K2O per acre. Okay? Now, I realize we're talking corn, canola, whatever, but nutrient uptake, nutrient mover, these are absolute numbers. And if we're going to support a higher yield environment 15 years from now, we need to start preparing for that higher yield environment today with our fertility programs. Sulfur's already been touched on. From my perspective, sulfur we're plugging it in. Okay, 7-to-1, 6-to-1 ratio, you know, that's kind of where we're falling in. What I see is that if I have an extra bump in yield potential as a function of in-season moisture, my guys are a lot more likely to go in and supply additional N. Sometimes it's a little bit more problematic to do some sulfur. So I tend to try to be a little bit more assertive on the front end with sulfur. The other piece too is that sulfur demand, if you look at sulfur demand versus your other crops, this is crazy. I mean, look at the sulfur demand curve for canola versus the other crops that we're growing. Okay. The other part of this is look at when it's all happening. You know, as we're getting into you know, the bulk of that biomass that's coming on, and the concern that I have is, am I going to have sulfur available at that time? Sulfur is mobile in the soil in the sulfate form, immobile in the plant. Okay, and so I can't scavenge the plant to find sulfur. I've got to make sure that's there the whole time. So making sure that I've accomplished that somehow, pretty critical. I'm just going to touch on boron, and I like the comment that Don made about we're kind of plugging in some micronutrients as insurance policies, and that's what we're doing. The presentation this morning talked about the immobility of boron. In my higher rainfall environment, irrigated environment, low organic matter soils, low CEC soils, I actually worry about boron mobility. And am I pushing that boron too far, too fast? The plant isn't going to get it. So a slightly different twist on it. We're actually plugging in boron with our glyphosate applications. Wherever we can get that on, we try to do it. Looking for ways to plug that into the cropping system that are most logistically feasible. You know, products that have boron as part of the prill itself, whether that's an elemental sulfur product or whether it's a potassium product, how can we figure out a way to get that in? And the other piece that I'll kind of close out with here is just I have really enjoyed using tissue tests. I think tissue tests are as valuable in my mind, maybe even more so than soil tests, as a way to gauge nutrient uptake in that crop. And I'd also say that we have to place that in the context of some other data. What do we know about the nutrient uptake demand of this crop? What do we know about the soil test that's being grown in? What do we know about the year? What do we know about heat, moisture, those kind of things that might impact nutrient uptake and sequestration? Got an example of a tissue test here. This is pulled first part of June, and then the mid to later part of June, seedling stage where we're pulling the whole plant, and then rosette, and where we just pulled the newest leaf. And you can really start to gauge the effectiveness of our fertility program. Am I seeing a nitrogen spike that maybe is somewhat attributable to the UAN pass that we did? Am I seeing increases in some of my nitrogen boron because of some management things? Okay, I don't know exactly what all these numbers mean. Okay, but I'm capturing them, and we're looking at what's my fertility program look like? What does my soil test look like? What are we doing in season? Is this carrying through to yield? Do we have significant spatial variability that I need to be addressing at a field level? Those kind of things. Okay, so. I don't know how much time I've taken, but that's it. Thank you.
The question is, are in-furrow treatments more efficient at providing nutrients than other methods?
Yeah. Of course, all of this has to be couched in the context of the soil environment, pH, soil test levels, you know, calcium, all that stuff. But generally speaking, year of application efficiency with phosphorus placed with near the seed is dramatically better, So we're kind of growing a lot of bushels on not a lot of phosphorus, to be perfectly candid. The other piece of this too is that we have to remember that generally speaking, with most of the phosphorus products that we're applying, we're only accessing a portion of that anyway, 10 to 15%. So really it's about understanding the yield environment that you're dealing with, and I would say the yield environment across the cropping system, not just canola, and the uptake removal relationship within that yield environment, and then taking a look at your fertility program. Does it kind of match up? And there's good reasons why we wouldn't. You know, in years where phosphate is $1,000 a ton, I'm going to be doing everything I can to maximize efficiency. I'm probably not going to be that cognizant of removal in that particular year. But I may have fields where I have to be a little bit more assertive. So I guess that, in my mind, that's the take-home message for phosphorus and for potassium, is I think we need to be on a nutrient management trajectory that makes sense for the yield environment that we are today and the yield environment that we anticipate 15 years from now. We're growing today's crops on the decisions that we made yesterday, as much as we are on the decisions that we're making today. And with phosphorus and potassium, I think that's a critical concept for us to make sure that we're cognizant of in our planning. I don't know if that answers your question, but I might just ranted. And, you know, we've kind of became, I don't know, maybe a little bit pragmatic in our approach. And it's, if we're going across that field, can we plug it in? So can it go in with a burn down? Yeah, I'll do that. Boom, put it in. What about my UAN pass? Does it make sense for it to go in then? Boom, yeah, put it in. I mean, again, boron's a nutrient that actually in my environment I'm a little bit concerned about mobility in the soil, and it's immobile in the plant. And we know it's critical as we're transitioning from vegetative to reproductive. So the role that it plays in seed set, pollen viability, those kind of things. I mean, if you take your canola pods and you hold them up to the light and you're seeing a lot of gaps in there, you know, I would be taking a very strong look at my boron. Now, I'm not going to say that boron is a universal need everywhere, but right in my area, I'm seeing a need for boron in our canola, especially when I get into irrigated, and especially when my yield environment is in that 80 bushel kind of range. So, yeah, excellent. The question was the proportion of Roundup Ready canola in my geography. You know, I would say it's like 95%. And the reason for that is we didn't really have I mean, we were pretty much a wheat kind of system. And we moved to canola because of resistance concerns with some of the chemistries that we were using in wheat. Right now, you know, it's a kind of a 1 in 3 kind of a thing. So, I mean, the resistance is on the radar, but we've got a cropping system, I think, that's going to buy us a lot of time with that. Yeah. Winter wheat, spring wheat, canola. Some guys will throw in a pulse. Some guys will throw in seed potatoes. We've got some forages in there too. So we've got a fairly diverse cropping system. So that's helping a bunch. So.
I think if you look at canola, you know, with the spring canolas, what we're doing is adopting Canadian technology. And you have, you know, Roundup Ready and Liberty Link canolas, and, you know, they're all herbicide tolerant technologies. And Canada grows 20 million acres of spring canola, and we grow less than 1 million, so.
Keep heading down the wrong road, sorry, for they introduced some chlorophyll wheat in there, and we're gonna have this in every.
So, say again, Clearfield wheat and what now?
Going Roundup resistant wheat.
Well, no, yeah. I mean, that's maybe a question that's way beyond my pay grade here.
No Roundup Ready wheat out there,
Yes, there's no Roundup Ready wheat out there.
except that one isolated case in Oregon where we
except
don't
for
know
a
where
few
it came from.
accidents. Yeah. Yeah. My personal feeling on that, and I don't know if this is relevant or not, but I think there's enough concern over Roundup Ready wheat that I don't think we're gonna see that in the near future. And I might be wrong on that.
Well, I think we should have a major concern for herbicide resistance, whether we're using herbicide-resistant crops or not. The crop that has the highest number of resistant weeds is wheat, and we have no GM weeds, right? No herbicide-tolerant weeds, but wheat is the crop that has the highest number of herbicide-resistant weeds in it. So it's important to manage for herbicide resistance, whether you're in a GM system or not.
Perfect, yep. Comment, question? The spring burn down in my mind has been, we can't skip that. I mean, I've had guys that have looked at a field early in the spring and they're going, well, it really doesn't look like there's much there. I don't know if I need it. Leave a strip and they're convinced that I am not pulling that glyphosate pass out pre-plant. You know, canola is a competitive crop, but it's not competitive early on. And so I think seeding that into a clean seed bed is critical. We do have some guys that are doing fall burn downs, depending on the cropping system. Sometimes that's just, they run out of time before it gets done. And so they're going in the spring. Yeah.
We'll move on. Okay, got a few minutes left. I'm Paul Carter, WSU Extension out of Columbia County, Dayton, Washington. Mostly wheat country. We do graze some spring canola. We've tried a little bit of winter canola. It's not been real successful, but we do occasionally do that. So we also have quite a bit of mustard, spring mustards, but most of our cropping system is winter and spring wheat. Anyway, I've done some research on looking at soil pH issues. I've been looking at that for the last 10 years and seeing some issues develop. So I've done some survey work. I want to bring up a little bit of that. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about soil health, soil sampling, you know, for decision making, some of the agronomic effects of poor soil health, and then how do we get the health back. And Jill Clapperton talked a lot this morning about soil health and how important that is. We just talked about the nutrient levels and some of the issues when you've got a pH in the low 4s, mid 4s. We're going to bring a little bit of that out. So some of the factors concerning a healthy soil are, you know, we need good soil structure, and Jill talked about that this morning and what that is. And the structure we've kind of lost when we did all the moldboard plowing and we beat that soil to death, and then we don't have any earthworms left, and so we need to get that structure back. But we also need a neutral pH, and a neutral pH is running somewhere in that 6.2 to 7.3 pH level. If you look at your chemical labels, most of them will say the minimum or the best pH is above 6.2, and unless they're affected by the higher pH levels. So we need to get that back. We need to have a good active living microbial activity within the soil. And if we don't have that, if we have a low pHs, we probably don't have that active microbial going on. So that's going to help break down the residue. It's going to help provide some of the nutrients that we need to get a hold of. Then we need a balance of our macronutrients. And we don't talk too much about just the macros and the micros, but we need to have those balanced well. And you can see right there, we're looking at the macronutrients as the N, P, and K, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And we need those in there in a pretty balanced ratio. We look at the micronutrients, which we seldom talk about, and as Don brought up, we don't know a lot about some of that, especially with canola. We don't talk about it much with wheat either, but some of those are really important, and chlorine's one of them that's very important in wheat. And I'm not sure where we stand as far as canola on that one. So looking at some of the soil pH and acidity, what happens when the soil pH goes down? You know, we've got an acidity situation, and we start to develop these deficiencies of certain nutrients and toxicities of others. And the toxicity issues, you know, just talked about a little bit, but that's aluminum and iron, manganese. Those can be certainly major issues within our system. So you take a look at the crops that are at risk, and I plugged canola in there, and the kind of the minimum pH we'd like to see for canola is around 5.5. And we've got a lot of soils that are below that, at least in the top foot, top 6 inches even. But you can see lentils, peas, canola up there, barley gets in a little bit of trouble when you get down to 5.2. Wheat, what listed as 5.1 pH, it's kind of a critical level, although we can still grow some. If you have a really acidic soil, you might be looking at triticale as an alternate crop that we can actually get some yield out of. So that's something to look at too. We just mentioned the efficiencies of some of our nutrients, and I know that Marcus just brought up that when we get down to a pH of 5, about half of our nutrients are unavailable. They're out there, but they're not really available to us, to the plant. So as we bring those up and we get around the pH of 7, then they're all there. So here's another chart of similar to what he showed. These are the 6 macronutrients. And you can see as we get down there around 5.5, they start to diminish to the point that our plants are going to be stressed, trying to get a hold of those nutrients. And they go on down into the 4 ranges down here, and you can see that we're getting even less and less availability. But, you know, these are some major concerns. So as they get down there, the aluminum becomes more available, right? That's one of the issues. We get toxicities of that, so that's going to help cause poor root development. We'll see some uneven crop development out there in the field, and I'm sure that Marcus can see that. If he's got that kind of variability in the field, there are little pockets out there of really good growth of crops, and then you'll find these little areas where it's really short. The crop doesn't look very good, and we've often, on wheat especially, we might blame that on, well, maybe we didn't get any nitrogen on that spot or didn't get enough on it. But it may not be nitrogen at all. It may be all pH driven. Because if we have an acid situation, we've not got the availability of those nutrients. We're probably going to see some discoloration, yellowing of the crops if we've got a toxicity issue with aluminum. Probably some drought stress. And the reason I say that is we're not going to have the root development that we'd like to see. So it's going to be more susceptible to drier conditions because we just don't have the number of roots. And Jill alluded to that this morning. If you've got a plant that just doesn't have very many roots, it's probably not going to be able to get the moisture that is there, at least efficiently. And we may have what we call winter kill. And winter kill can come from a lot of reasons. But if that plant's already stressed going into winter, and we have a hard winter on top of that, it may have a difficult time making it with poor root development. So, survey that I did in the county, we surveyed 76 fields throughout the county and in Columbia there just to see where we're at on soil pH issues. Because I've heard quite a bit, well, we have a pH issue where it was formerly forested soils, or it's higher rainfall, you know, some comments like that. So I wanted to see what the extent was. Now, Columbia County is based at the bottom of the Blue Mountains, and we go all the way to the Snake River. So we have a rainfall zone of about 10 inches up to 40 inches in the mountains, and about 25 miles. So we have a really rapid rainfall change. So the survey shows that we have an issue pretty well throughout the whole county. We sampled as broadly as we could across all rainfall zones, cropping systems. And what you'll see here is we've got 2 big spikes up here that go up to almost an 8 pH. And those are a couple of isolated situations, just like what Marcus brought up that he's got. All of the rest of them, except for these starred ones, we're down in this, 5.5 or below. 89% of the fields were below 5.2 in the top 6 inches. And 89%. These starred ones were native soil sites we picked out. One was a cemetery that had been there since time began. Had to make sure we didn't probe in the wrong spot. But you can see those pHs are running 6.5 to 6.8. Those are our native soils, and so we've depleted a lot of our soil capacity to maintain that soil pH level. So Dr. Mahler did some work in the University of Idaho. He did a survey back in 1980, reworked some of that in 1995. And his numbers he indicated 9% of the fields were above pH of 6 in 1980. 38% were between 5.6 and 5.9. Now this is in the top foot, and that's what we usually aggregate. The work that I've done indicates that we've got 3% of the fields that are above 6 pH, and only 8% of them are in that 5.6 to 5.9 pH. We've slipped a bunch if we have a representative sample here. So the indication is that we've got over 50% of our fields now down in that 5.2 to 5.4 pH range. And 5.3 to 5.4 is about where we start to see aluminum begin to come available. So we're in that critical range where we're going to start to see more aluminum. The more aluminum we get, the more it begins to drive, and as the pH goes down, we get what we call a cascade effect. And we don't want to go there. So those are the numbers that I found. One of the things I've tried to do is we sampled in stratified layers so we can begin to see where some of this pH actually is coming from. So an example here, we did a 0 to 3 inch depth, 3 to 6, 6 to 12, and typically we sample that 1 foot separately, right? We aggregate that as one sample. So in this particular case, we had the top layer was 5.6. We went down to 4.9 right in that seed zone where we're putting our nitrogen and just right in that rooting zone. And then it came back up to 5.7 in the bottom 6 inches of that. If we'd have sampled that as a 1 foot increment, we'd have had a 5.3. And we think, well, okay, it's 5.3, but that's tolerable, right? But what about that 4.9 laying in there just right below your seed zone? Those roots have got to, if it's winter crop, we're talking about winter canola here, how well are those roots going to survive in that little more of an acid situation, increased aluminum availability and some things that way? So one of the things we're trying to do with it is with extension work is we want to try to get people to look at some of this, and one of the tools that's out there is a meter like this that we can actually do a pH sample right in the field. We don't get all the other nutrients, but right now we'd like to know where our pH is. So we can use this meter and check right instantaneously in the field. We can collect the soil core, and we can touch that soil core all the way down through it, an inch at a time, half inch at a time, where we want to, and get some pH values to see where we're at, see where that acid zone is if we have one. And then we can record the results with the idea of, now we've got some information, what can we do with it? So as an example of that, I have a field right here this is the same field right here. We have this area here where no vegetation is growing in it. This is in the springtime. We would expect to see some volunteer wheat or something in that. Right next to it, we've got quite a bit of volunteer stuff growing there. So I did a soil sample on it, and interestingly enough, that top inch was a 4.1 pH, where we didn't have anything growing. 50 feet away, it was 5.7 in that top inch. So obviously the acidity is causing a problem because nothing wanted to grow in the 4.1 pH. So if you've got that little circle out there, it's not growing very well. Maybe it is pH rather than some of the other things. And of course, one of the first things we look at is, well, it was probably herbicide carryover, right? Or maybe we just got too much in there. I mean, the first thing we go to is to say herbicide was the issue. And maybe that's not where we ought to be going. Maybe we need to take a look at our soil. Like I say, this is the year of the soil, so let's be diligent and actually take a look at it. So this brings me to think about, we have these weed communities developing out there. Maybe they're somewhat pH driven as well. So these are some questions I ask. I don't have the answers to them. We do have a little bit of information out of the Midwest that that I found. But we got rat-tail fescue, horseweed, prickly lettuce, downy brome, that are all becoming more and more of an issue as we go to less tillage systems. And the first thing we do is blame it on the herbicide didn't work, or it's resistant, or it's tolerant to it, and that's where the problem's at. But I'd like to ask the question, could it be an acidity problem that's helping cause that? Do the weeds prefer a lower pH value? Do they like a more acid atmosphere maybe than the crop does? So part of my presentations I've done this winter is get people to try to think about that a little bit. Let's think outside the box a little and consider some other possibilities. We do know that herbicides are formulated to operate in that neutral zone. When the manufacturer made that, they made it for a soil that was in that 6 to 7 pH basically. And most of your labels will say 6.2. But you can see the ones there that become a little bit of a problem if you got a pH below 6. And some of your product labels will say, well, it's poor management, and they're not going to cover issues that you have with our herbicide if your pH is below that. They do have an out on their label if they really want to. So the next thing I wanted to look at is we keep saying we got a lot more disease issues as well. So is that maybe pH driven? That's another question I'm asking. And there again, I don't necessarily have the answer to it, but we do have some information. The indication is that the Cef-stripe in winter wheat is an issue if we get below 5.5, and we're starting to see more of that out there in the field. Fusarium wilt in peas can be more of an issue below 5.7. Well, what about Pythium and Phytophthora root rot? We don't know for sure, but it looks like maybe 5.7 is an area below that it might be more prevalent. Is that because of aluminum or acid burn on the roots that first break it open so the diseases can get in there better? I'm not sure. So I put together a little bit of a list why we need to look at increasing our soil pH if we've got a low one. And I apologize for those that are coming from a high pH issue that, some of the Montana area certainly is, and we have some areas in the state that are as well. But so we need to neutralize the toxic effects of these elements that become an issue, like your aluminum, iron, manganese. You've got the hydrogen in there, which is causing a lot of the acidity problem. Need to improve their overall nutrient availability by raising pH, increase microbial activity, earthworms as well. Improve the soil structure, and calcium helps do that. One of the things we've seen is we're starting to see an accumulation of the calcium in that 6 to 12 inch layer and a little bit of a deficiency in the top 6 inches. So it's been mobilized down to a certain extent. It's still in the system, but it's not there readily available. Overall improved plant health, reduce weed competition, maybe. I raised that question on the weeds and where they're the most active. Maybe reduce disease impact, maximize our herbicide effectiveness. And I think that's not a question. I think we know that one. And reduce herbicide carryover. Beyond herbicide, for example, is if you go below a 6.2 pH, you just went from a 3-month crop rotational to a 15-month. And that's big as we're trying to manage our cropping system. So a little bit on how lime reduces soil acidity, and I've run out of time here, but we've got the hydrogen ions on the soil. We use calcium carbonate there as a method it's about the only method we've got other than maybe earthworms helping us, but it replaces the hydrogen ion on there and creating a water and carbon dioxide. And that's the basic part of it. So to conclude this, we need a healthy soil to maximize our crop production. We're probably leaving some yield on the table that we're not getting the use out of. And pH is probably the most overlooked and neglected aspect of crop production. So you can read the rest of them there. I'll not go into any more of them. Most of our soils need some lime application, and lime is about the only thing that we can fix it with. So with that, I'll quit. The question is, were all of the fields we sampled of the same cropping system? And pretty much they were. We run basically a winter wheat 3-4 year rotation. We do have a little bit of wheat fallow, but most of it's in annual cropping now. So, well, the question is what kind of tillage is on that, and most of it is a mixture of some kind of minimum tillage. We don't use moldboard plow anymore, so that's almost extinct in our area, but there will be some, maybe a chisel, disc, vertical tillage, some things that way. We're somewhere between a direct seed and probably 4-pass system, something like that. So the question is why some of the spring wheats especially are more tolerant to the acidity or aluminum. And it's chemical and a genetic aspect of that plant that causes that. And the roots exude certain things that bind the aluminum at the root surface, so it takes it out of context. But there is a gene within the plant that helps control that, and Dr. Mike Pumphrey at WSU Spring Wheat Breeder has been working on some of that. He said that they have identified a gene that does that. The thing to keep in mind, though, is it still doesn't maximize the potential of that crop. It may help you get a crop, but it's still going to be much reduced from what it would be. But yeah, they've learned a lot. Yes, sir. So the question is basically is what are we testing for when we do the soil sampling, and we do use the meter as a quick check to look at some things, but all of our samples did go to the lab, and we sampled for a full list of all nutrients and CEC and base saturation. And our base saturations were running somewhere between 65 and 75 pretty much. So not too bad there. That's part of what we're getting by on. Yeah, organic matter's running at about 1.5 to 2.5%. Okay, the question is how important is it to have some incorporation of a lime if you're going to make an application? Part of that will depend a little bit on what kind of lime product you're putting on, but tillage, some light tillage will certainly get it incorporated in the soil and get it moving quicker. Some information that we've gotten a hold of is that if you're in a no-till situation, you could expect that calcium carbonate to mobilize down about 1 inch a year if you don't incorporate. So that gives...
Particle size play a role in that?
Yeah, the question is on the particle size, and it certainly does play a big role in it. One of the things you need to look at as we get in a drier and drier situation is that it's more important to have a really quality product and a really fine particle product. The more moisture you've got, the less of an issue those both are.